most people say, if you don't like it here, get out. That's for spineless people. Spineless bastards who don't want to fight for what they believe in.
Report of the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. Chapter 2. Slavery in New England and at Harvard. Harvard University's early history is inseparable from that of colonial New England, and, thus, from the system of slavery. Harvard was important to the region's politics, society, and economy, and as slavery formed the basis of New England's economic life, so it shaped Harvard.
Veritas is the motto of Harvard University. On our shield, the word is displayed across 3 open books, suggesting both our mission of education and the transparency that's demanded of us.
In this chapter, 2.1 Indigenous Slavery and African Slavery. 2.2 Slavery at Harvard. Leading historians agree that the colonial economy thrived based on an economic alliance with the sugar islands of the West Indies. This trade involved the provision of food, fuel, and lumber produced in New England to plantations of the Caribbean, where those goods were exchanged for tobacco, coffee, and sugar produced by enslaved Africans or for enslaved people themselves. This effectively made Boston a slave society, according to one historian, but one where most of the enslaved toiled elsewhere, sustaining the illusion of Boston in New England as an inclusive republic devoted to the common good. Yet slavery was not absent from New England. By 1700, New Englanders had made at least 19 voyages to Africa and then to the West Indies, the chief route of the slave trade, as well as many more voyages between Massachusetts Bay and the Caribbean. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's Body of Liberties, written in 1641, made slavery and the slave trade lawful. The first legal code governing slavery in British North America, it prohibited bond slavery, unless it be of lawful captives, taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves, or are sold to us, leading one historian to note, the word unless has seldom carried more baggage. Even as it paid homage to the Magna Carta, the Body of Liberties permitted the buying, selling, and trading of indigenous people and Africans. Slavery would not officially end in Massachusetts until 1783. 2.1 Indigenous Slavery and African Slavery. Slavery in New England began when early colonists enslaved and sold indigenous people while dispossessing these native peoples of the land on which they had lived for generations. In 1636, the year Harvard was founded, merchants at Marblehead built and rigged a ship, 120 tons and very fast, called Desire. That summer, the Desire set sail carrying 17 Pequot war prisoners who were to be sold as slaves in Bermuda on the instructions of John Winthrop. The Puritan luminary John Winthrop founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony and served as its governor 4 times. As a leader in the colony's affairs, Winthrop oversaw the founding of Harvard College and served as one of its first overseers. A towering figure in early colonial history, who served several terms as governor and lieutenant governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop was a member of the original committee as to Ye College at Newtown, that is, Harvard. Winthrop himself enslaved the wife of a Pequot sachem and her 2 children in what he seems to have regarded as an act of Christian benevolence, reciprocity for her protection of 2 captured English girls during the conflict. 2 years later, on February 26, 1638, the Desire returned to Boston Harbor carrying cotton, tobacco, salt, and an unspecified number of enslaved Africans who had been purchased on Providence Island. The Desire was among the first American slave ships. It is possible that the man known to us only as the Moor, who was enslaved by Harvard's first schoolmaster, Nathaniel Eaton, and in that capacity served Harvard's earliest students, arrived in New England aboard the Desire. Not long after, in the early 1640s, a Bermuda minister named Patrick Copeland, grateful for Winthrop's remembrance of us in sending 12 New England Indians to us, began recruiting the children of wealthy Caribbean plantation owners to attend Harvard. As one historian has noted, education, like the flag, follows trade, and many sons of West Indian planters indeed followed trade to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Harvard. Harvard also benefited from land grants by the General Court, the colonial legislature, in 1653. 4. The encouragement of Harvard College and the society thereof, and for the more comfortable maintenance and provision for the president, fellows, and students thereof in time to come, this court doth grant unto the said society and corporation, for the ends aforesaid, 2,000 acres of land, within this jurisdiction, not formerly granted to any other, to be taken up in 2 or 3 places, where it may be found convenient. And to this end it is desired that the said corporation of the college, does appoint some persons in their behalf, to find out the places where such land may be freely taken, and to make return as soon as they may, that the court may more particularly and expressly confirm the same. The Harvard treasurer Thomas Danforth personally selected 4 tracts in Rhode Island and Connecticut, territory from which the Pequot had been driven. One aspect of the original mission of Harvard College was to educate, and convert, native students alongside white classmates. In the 1640s, the fledgling colony was in the throes of an economic crisis, and the college was on the edge of collapse. Christianizing indigenous people opened up vital new avenues of financial support. Devoted Puritans in England lined up to support the mission, and Parliament opened its coffers to aid the colonization effort by civilizing natives. The Charter of 1650, which has governed Harvard with few interruptions for more than 350 years, committed the institution to the education of the English and Indian youth. The Indian College building, Harvard's first made of brick, was constructed in 1655. Ultimately, however, Harvard enrolled only 5 native students in this era, and only Caleb Chi Shachomak received a degree during his lifetime. By 1670, the Indian College building had been given over to the college's printing press, and in 1690, it was dismantled, and its bricks were used to construct a new building for the use of white scholars. New England's First Fruits, published in London in 1943, advertised efforts to Christianize native peoples in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and highlighted the role that Harvard College played in the work. It was an effective fundraising tool for the college in its early years. This conjectural rendering, prepared for the university's tricentennial, in 1936, depicts the Harvard Indian College. Constructed around 1655, the building was the college's first built of brick. It was dismantled in 1690, and the bricks were used to construct a new building for scholars. Caleb Chi Shachomak, a Wampanoag man born on the island of Nope, now Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Massachusetts, was one of only 5 scholars to attend the Harvard Indian College and the only student of the Indian College granted a degree during his lifetime, in 1665. His portrait has hung in Annenberg Hall, the freshman dining hall, since 2010. As the colony grew, slavery now primarily, but not exclusively, African slavery remained central. In the colonial era, the system that W.E.B. Du Bois would eloquently describe more than 2 centuries later was just beginning to take shape. The giant forces of water and steam were harnessed to do the world's work, and the black workers of America bent at the bottom of a growing pyramid of commerce and industry, and they not only could not be spared, if this new economic organization was to expand, but rather they became the cause of new political demands and alignments, of new dreams of power and visions of empire. Black labor became the foundation stone not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. New cities were built on the results of black labor. The number of enslaved women, men, and children in Massachusetts, itself a small colony of some 33,000 inhabitants according to a 1675 census, remained relatively low until the end of the 17th century, and enslaved people formed part of a larger world of unfree labor that also included indentured white servants. In 1676, colonial administrator Edmund Randolph wrote that there were not above 200 slaves in the colony, and those are brought from Guinea and Madagascar. 4 years later, Governor Simon Bradstreet told the Lords of the Committee for Trade and Foreign Plantations, that there are a very few blacks born here, I think not above 5 or 6 at the most in a year. Unlike white indentured servants, who eventually left their unfree status behind, these enslaved Africans faced lifetimes of uncompensated labor, both for themselves and for their descendants. The enslaved population of Massachusetts rose quickly after the British Parliament's revocation of the Royal African Company's monopoly on English trade with Africa in 1696. It was also at this time that some New Englanders began to rebel against the growth of actual slavery on New England soil. Anti-slavery sentiment was not, however, at the root of resistance in this period. Rather, limited opposition to slavery grew largely out of a concern about the growing presence of black people and the effect that would have on society, fears that had gained salience in the wake of Bacon's rebellion in 1677. These concerns culminated in the passage in 1705, of an Act for the better preventing of a spurious and mixed issue, which put a prohibitive £4 tax on all slaves imported. The colonial legislature also adopted other measures designed to maintain the racial balance, such as the 1709 Act to encourage the importation of white servants, which promised payment of 40 shillings per white male servant imported into the colony and extended the 1705 import tax to include enslaved Native Americans. Despite such efforts, the number of enslaved people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony rose to 550 by 1708, and in 1720, Governor Samuel Shute wrote that with respect to slaves either Negroes or Indians, but most Negroes, they may be computed at about 2,000 alongside an English population of 94,000. By the middle of the 18th century, enslaved black people constituted the main source of bound labor in Massachusetts, outnumbering indentured servants, apprentices, and indigenous workers. 2.2 Slavery at Harvard. This 1767 engraving by Paul Revere shows a view of the college from the west, with Holden Chapel, Hollis Hall, Harvard Hall, the third, Old Stoughton Hall, constructed from the bricks of the Harvard Indian College, and Massachusetts Hall. The bustling passers-by on what is now Massachusetts Avenue include a black footman on the back of a coach. Sidebar: Elmwood, a complicated history. The residence of Harvard's president, known as Elmwood, has a long and complicated history. Its ownership by the university, however, is relatively recent. The house was left to Harvard in 1933 by Arthur Kingsley Porter, a faculty member, and the university took possession in 1962. Formerly the home of famous poets and diplomats and once a hospital for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, the building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was also a site of enslavement. The original owner of Elmwood, Thomas Oliver, was born on the Caribbean island of Antigua, in 1734, to the wealthy slave-holding owners of a sugar plantation. Several years after graduating from Harvard, in 1753, Oliver married Elizabeth Vassall, daughter of a Jamaican plantation owner, and the couple built their home in Cambridge near other members of the Harvard-connected Vassall and royal families. In 1774, Oliver was appointed Royal Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, a role that carried with it the responsibility of sitting on Harvard's Board of Overseers. It is unclear whether Oliver ever engaged with the college in this role, however, because colonists forced him to abandon his Cambridge home and move into Boston just weeks after he was sworn in. He fled the colony nearly 2 years later, in March 1776. We know that Oliver enslaved 11 people at Elmwood. Buff, Cato, Jerry, Jeffrey, Samuel, Myra, Jude, Sarah, Jenny, Violet, and young Jerry, because he petitioned the British government, in 1783 for compensation, £480 for 11 valuable slaves, the 10 enslaved people he left behind plus Samuel, who made the journey with Oliver, but was free by the laws of England. On Harvard's campus, the story was much the same. Over nearly 150 years, from the university's founding in 1636 until the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court found slavery unlawful, Harvard presidents and other leaders, as well as its faculty and staff, enslaved more than 70 individuals, some of whom labored on campus. Enslaved men and women served Harvard presidents and professors and fed and cared for Harvard students. The enslaved man known as the Moor, who could have arrived aboard the Desire, was the first of many enslaved people who would serve Harvard students in the colonial era. Titus, Venus, Juba, and Bilhah, all enslaved people, served Harvard presidents Benjamin Wadsworth and Edward Holyoke. Yet more people were enslaved by Harvard stewards and, in this capacity, likely served Harvard students and maintained its campus. In 1741, Harvard faculty resolved to prohibit students from associating with Titus, slave of the late Rev. Priest Wadsworth's, and to bar him from the campus. The college steward was also ordered not to employ Titus, who apparently remained near the campus after his former enslaver's death. The steward was a prominent role in the early years of the college, one that commanded respect and status. Stewards were responsible for feeding the scholars on campus, along with collecting student fees, overseeing staff engaged in student services, and paying many of the college's bills. They also provided lavish feasts for the annual commencement celebrations. From Harvard's founding, in 1636, through the beginning of the American Revolution, only 10 men, 5 from the same family, held the position. Of these 10, at least 3 owned enslaved people whose labor maintained the Harvard campus and sustained Harvard students. Among the Harvard stewards who owned enslaved people, Andrew Boardman, II, steward from 1703 to 1747, stands out for having enslaved at least 8 individuals. The documentation of his slaveholding is also characteristic of the period's sparse records, but the picture becomes clear when the evidence is viewed as a whole. First, A deed of sale shows that Boardman paid £40 to buy a man named Cuff and that his brother-in-law, future Harvard President Benjamin Wadsworth, witnessed the purchase. Separately, in the steward's notebook, Boardman recorded the names of 4 children born to a woman named Rose, Flora, Jeffrey, Caesar, and Jane, an enslaved woman who died at the age of 22. Jane's tombstone still stands in the old burying ground near Harvard Yard, inscribed Jane, a Negro servant of Andrew Boardman, and it is adjacent to a similar memorial of Cicely, a black woman enslaved by the Harvard tutor, fellow, and treasurer William Bradle. We know that Rose and her other children were also enslaved because according to Massachusetts law at this time, children inherited the status of their mothers. If Jane was enslaved, then so too were her mother and siblings. 2 additional people enslaved by Andrew Boardman and his widow, Elizabeth Boardman, appear in extant records. Lucy, Indian servant of Mr. Boardman, was baptized in 1740. Peter, Negro manservant of Mrs. Elizabeth Boardman, married a woman enslaved in Charlestown in 1758. We cannot know whether the Boardman family owned all 8 of these people at the same time. But if Andrew Boardman owned even Rose and her 4 children all at once, this would have made him one of the largest slaveholders in the colony. In the only surviving tax assessment for the town of Cambridge during this period, from 1749, the largest number of enslaved people recorded in a single household was 4. Such was Boardman's reliance on enslaved labor to feed Harvard students and fulfill his duties as steward. Other Harvard leaders and faculty members also owned enslaved people in this period. Take, for example, Professor John Winthrop. A direct descendant of the colonial governor of the same name, Winthrop earned his A.M. from Harvard in 1732 and served as Hollis Professor of Mathematics and Natural Philosophy from 1738 until his death in 1779. He was also a Fellow from 1765 to 1779 and served as acting president in 1769 and again from 1773 to 1774. Harvard's Winthrop House is named for Professor Winthrop as well as for his ancestor, the colonial governor. Sidebar: Fellows and Overseers, Harvard's governing boards. Harvard has a unique governance structure, with 2 distinct bodies that, together, perform the role of a more typical board of trustees. These are the Harvard Corporation, officially the president and fellows of Harvard College, and the Board of Overseers. Today, the Harvard Corporation is the smaller of the bodies, formed by the president, treasurer, and fellows. Its responsibilities are primarily fiduciary and supervisory in nature, including overseeing annual budgets, capital projects, general finances, the endowment, and appointing presidents. The Board of Overseers is composed of alumni. Its responsibilities are tied to the academic life of the university. It advises university leadership and directs the visiting committees to the university, which investigate and report on the school's execution of their stated goals. The selection methods and qualifications for these bodies' members have evolved over time. Overseers, for example, used to be chosen from local government and clergy, but their important roles have remained constant. For clarity, throughout this report, members of the corporation are identified by their individual titles: president, treasurer, or fellow, and members of the Board of Overseers are identified with the title overseer. Professor John Winthrop is a direct descendant of the early Massachusetts governor and Harvard overseer of the same name. Both men, who are the namesakes of Harvard's Winthrop House, enslaved multiple people. On a single page of his 1759 Ames Almanac, Winthrop notes the death of his enslaved Negro man George. 13, May, a few minutes before 1 in ye morning, Our poor George died of a hectic, which he was thrown into by ye measles, having never been well since he had this temp. He was aged 24 years and 1 day. Further down the same page Winthrop recorded that he procured a replacement. Had a new Negro boy, I call Scipio. He now measures 3 feet and 11 inches, with shoes. By comparing his height with ye of our boys, I judge him to be 8½ years old. Enslaved people in the household of Professor John Winthrop would have performed many of the tasks of running a home, freeing the professor to pursue his studies. Winthrop owned at least 2 enslaved servants, George, who died in 1759, and Scipio, a young boy Winthrop acquired in 1761. It is unclear when Winthrop acquired this boy. Not all of his notes are dated. In a subsequent note, this one dated February 6, 1761, Winthrop provides additional information about his own son's age and height, the basis for his estimate of Scipio's 8½ years. The fact of Winthrop's slaveholding is not new. It is noted in Sibley's Harvard Graduates, a compendium of biographical sketches of colonial-era Harvard alumni. But the story, as told in Sibley's, is sympathetic. The passage on George's death reads, "When Winthrop's own slave boy, George, died of the measles, he was mourned as one of the family, not as an unfortunate investment." As for Scipio, Sibley's reports he was watched over like the white children of the family. The truth, however, is that Scipio and George were undoubtedly purchased to labor for the Winthrops without compensation. In 1773, a decade or so after Winthrop purchased Scipio and several years before the official end of slavery in the Commonwealth, human bondage captivated an audience at Harvard's commencement ceremony. 2 candidates for the bachelor's degree, Eliphalet Pearson and Theodore Parsons, participated in a public debate concerning the legality of slavery. Parsons, then 21 years old, took the anti-slavery position. To me, I confess, it is a matter of painful astonishment that those who are so readily disposed to urge the principles of natural equality in defense of their own liberties should, with so little reluctance, continue to exert a power by the operation of which they are so flagrantly contradicted. For what less can be said of that exercise of power, whereby such multitudes of our fellow men, descendants, my friend from the same common parent with you and me, and between whom and us nature has made no distinction, save what arises from the stronger influence of the sun in the climate whence they originated, are held to groan under the insupportable burden of the most abject slavery. In 1773, the Harvard commencement celebrations featured a forensic dispute on the legality of slavery, with future Harvard president Eliphalet Pearson arguing in favor. Just 10 years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled slavery incompatible with the new Massachusetts Constitution. Defending slavery, Pearson called for the abandonment of tender sentiment and a calm return to the voice of reason. Although he conceded that liberty to all is sweet, he went on to argue that slavery was a benefit to Africans, who had in his view been rescued by slavers, characterizing life in Africa as an entire subjection to the tyrannizing power of lust and passion. Pearson implored the audience, "Reflect, I say, a moment upon the condition of a creature in human shape, for in such a state of degradation one can hardly call him a man, the misery, the wretchedness, and compare it with the condition of a slave in this country." He concluded, "The slave's removal from Africa is to be esteemed a favor." Slavery was not an abstraction to either man, nor to the other students and faculty at Harvard. Slavery had, by this time, long been a fact of everyday life in Massachusetts. Parsons's impassioned argument against the institution was about more than overheard tales of abject brutality in the sugar-cane fields of the Caribbean, to which New England was economically tied. His father, Reverend Moses Parsons, owned 2 men and a woman named Violet. Parsons' son later recalled, when it was generally believed that slavery was unlawful in Massachusetts, the Reverend summoned his slaves into his sitting room, and there, in the presence of his children, declared to them that they were free. The men accepted the gift, or rather the declaration, for gift it was not. Yet Violet, who would have been about 8 years older than Parsons, roughly as old as his eldest brother, stayed with the Parsons family until her death at the age of 90, and is now buried in the Parsons family tomb in Byfield, Massachusetts. John Thornton Kirkland, president of Harvard University, officiated her funeral. Theodore Parsons became a doctor. 6 years after his graduation from Harvard College, at age 28, he shipped aboard the warship Bennington as its surgeon. He disappeared at sea a few days later, and his body was never found. Eliphalet Pearson became Harvard's Hancock Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental languages in 1786 and served as president of the university from 1804 to 1806. He died in 1826.